Nestled between two weather-worn brick buildings on a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia, stood a little flower shop that time seemed to have forgotten. Its windows were always filled with soft sunlight and the gentle silhouettes of roses, daisies, and lavender stems swaying in delicate arrangements. Inside, the air smelled of earth and rainwater, and everything moved at a slower, softer pace, like the hush of a Sunday morning. Emma, the shop's owner, moved among the blooms with the grace of someone who had made peace with sorrow. At 47, she carried the gentle wear of someone who had loved deeply and lost quietly. A widow for over a decade, Emma rarely spoke of her husband, or the daughter she once had, but the tenderness with which she touched each petal told stories she never said out loud. Locals often said the shop felt like a sanctuary, somewhere you didn't just buy flowers, but where your heart could take a breath. Tourists would stumble in, drawn by the scent and softness, and find themselves talking to Emma about things they hadn't planned to share. She never offered advice. Just a listening ear, a warm smile, and a bouquet that somehow always felt like it knew what you needed. Emma believed flowers could speak. She often said, "Some things are too deep for words, but flowers, they know." She crafted each arrangement as if composing a letter to the soul. Every bloom chosen with care. Every ribbon tied like a whispered promise. And though her shop was small and quiet, it held more healing than most grand hospitals or loud churches. Because in a world full of noise, Emma's flowers had learned the language of silence, and the beauty of being heard. Charles Whitman had built empires, skyscrapers that bore his name, corporations that stretched across oceans, but none of it filled the silence that echoed through the halls of his riverfront mansion. At 68, he was a man carved by grief. Since the death of his wife, the sparkle in his eyes had dulled, replaced by a heavy stillness. He rarely entertained guests, rarely left his estate. The world knew him as a billionaire, a visionary, a man of numbers and power. But in truth, Charles had become a ghost in his own home. The only light that remained in his life was Daniel, his 9-year-old son. Once full of laughter and endless curiosity, Daniel had changed after the accident. A spinal injury had left him unable to speak, his expressions frozen, his joy hidden deep behind unmoving eyes. Therapists came and went. Specialists flew in from across the country. But after more than a year, the boy remained locked in his quiet world. Charles tried everything. Toys, music, therapy dogs, even art. Nothing broke through. He sat beside his son each morning in the garden by the river, hoping for a flicker, a smile, a glance, a single sound. But Daniel only stared, lost in a place no one could reach. Charles never said it aloud, but the silence scared him. Not because he couldn't fix it, but because he feared his son had already given up. And so, each day, he carried the weight of two broken hearts, his own, and the one he could no longer hear beating in his child. He didn't know that hope would return in the most unexpected form. Not from medicine or science, but from a single flower. And a woman who believed flowers could speak. It was a cloudy Tuesday afternoon when Charles, for reasons he couldn't explain, turned his car down the quiet lane that led to a small flower shop nestled beneath moss-draped oaks. He hadn't planned it. He rarely made unscheduled stops. But that day, something pulled him there, perhaps the ache of memory, or the weight of another silent morning with Daniel. He opened the door with a quiet chime and guided his son gently inside. The air smelled like rain and lavender. Flowers in every shade whispered from their vases. Charles approached the counter to ask about a bouquet for his late wife, something simple, respectful. As he spoke with the young clerk, he didn't notice Emma emerge from the back room. She didn't say anything. Just walked slowly toward the little boy standing still as stone. Emma knelt to his eye level. Her eyes met his, soft, searching. Without a word, she reached into a nearby vase and pulled out a single white daisy. She slipped it into Daniel's small hand and whispered so gently it was almost wind, "This flower will speak for you today." Daniel blinked. His fingers curled around the stem. Then slowly, he pulled the daisy to his chest and held it there, close to his heart. And then, tears. They slid silently down his cheeks. Emma didn't react with surprise. She simply stayed there with him, grounded in his quiet. Charles turned, his voice trailing off mid-sentence. When he saw the tears on his son's face, his body froze. It was the first sign of emotion Daniel had shown in over a year. Not the therapists. Not the doctors. Not even him. Just a flower. And a woman who believed it could carry what words could not. The morning after the flower shop encounter, Emma arrived early to open the store, as she always did. The dew was still clinging to the glass panes, and she was trimming a vase of wild asters when the front door chimed softly. Standing there was a woman in a crisp black coat, poised, formal, unmistakably from another world. "I work for Mr. Charles Whitman," the woman said, offering a small envelope with the weight of something far more personal than paper. "He asked me to deliver this personally." Emma took it with a puzzled smile. The envelope was thick, embossed with initials she didn't recognize until she flipped it open. Inside was a letter written in careful, deliberate script. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. "Ms. Emma, I don't understand what happened yesterday. But my son cried, for the first time in over a year. If you're willing, I'd like to invite you to visit our home. Not as a therapist, but as someone who seems to speak his language. A floral emotional consultant, if you will." Emma blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She had never heard of such a title, and certainly never thought she'd be offered one by a billionaire. She read the note again. It wasn't polished. It wasn't cold. It was a father asking for help. Not with money. Not with influence. But with something far more delicate, a boy's broken heart. Emma stood there quietly, the letter pressed to her chest, unsure of what path she had just been invited into. But deep down, something told her. Flowers weren't done speaking for Daniel. Emma sat alone behind the counter, the letter from Charles resting quietly on her lap. The flower shop was empty, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the scent of fresh-cut peonies. She had read his note at least a dozen times, each word sinking deeper, heavier, like petals falling one by one into water. A floral emotional consultant. It sounded lovely. Absurd. Impossible. She smiled softly to herself, then shook her head. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't trained to heal anyone's trauma. She was just a woman who once held her daughter's tiny hand as it went still, and had never stopped listening to silence since. When the house went quiet after the funeral, Emma found solace in flowers. Each one seemed to hold a language the world had forgotten, gentle, honest, patient. In time, they spoke for her. In time, they helped her breathe again. But what could she possibly offer a billionaire and his wounded child? She pulled out a small photo from her apron pocket, faded now, edges worn smooth from years of being touched. A little girl in rain boots, holding a bouquet twice her size. Emma closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Maybe she couldn't fix anything. But maybe she didn't have to. She walked to the back room, cut a single sprig of lavender, and placed it on the counter beside the letter. Then, with quiet conviction, she picked up a pen and scribbled a reply. "Mr. Whitman, I'm not a doctor. I don't pretend to be. But if your son finds comfort in flowers, I'm willing to bring him a few more. Not as a healer. Not as a professional. But as a mother who still believed in the quiet power of petals." By the end of the week, Emma found herself standing at the gates of the Whitman estate, a sprawling ivy-covered mansion perched along the river, as silent and somber as the man who owned it. She clutched a small bouquet wrapped in brown paper, white hyacinths, soft chamomile, and a single pink peony tucked at the center. Not fancy. Not grand. But thoughtful. She had agreed to come twice a week. No expectations. No promises. Just flowers. Just stories. When the housekeeper led her through the long marble halls, Emma felt out of place, like a wild daisy in a room full of crystal chandeliers. But when she stepped into the sunroom where Daniel sat, everything else faded. The boy was curled in an armchair, gazing out toward the river. Still as ever. Silent. Emma didn't ask him to speak. She didn't reach for his hand. She simply sat beside him, unwrapped the bouquet, and laid it gently on the table. "These are chamomile," she said softly, as though speaking to the air. "They're quiet little things, don't like attention. But did you know they help people sleep better? Even flowers can be gentle and brave at the same time." Daniel didn't look at her. But his eyes flicked, just slightly, toward the blooms. From that day on, Emma returned every Tuesday and Friday, each time bringing a new arrangement and a new story. Sunflowers that chased the sun. Lavender that whispered peace. Daisies that remembered. She never asked for a response. She simply believed that somehow, deep inside, Daniel was listening. And in her heart she knew. Flowers didn't need words to be understood. The Whitman estate was a masterpiece of architecture. Grand columns, polished stone floors, and windows tall enough to frame the sky. But beneath all the beauty, there was a stillness that clung to the air like dust on untouched furniture. Everything gleamed, everything functioned, but nothing felt alive. Emma had never been in a place so immaculate, yet so empty. Every clock in the house ticked with perfect precision. Meals were served to the second. Curtains opened and closed by remote control. Even the flowers in the vases, perfect white, scentless, looked as if they'd never truly bloomed. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, faces polite but unreadable. No one lingered. No one laughed. It was a house where grief had settled in like wallpaper, present in every room, but never acknowledged. Emma carried her small bouquet through the long hallways like a flicker of something human. She noticed how the walls were lined with portraits of ancestors, all stern-eyed and regal. But no pictures of Daniel. No drawings. No fingerprints on the glass. When she reached the sunroom where Daniel waited, she paused, not because she was intimidated, but because she understood. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress built to hold in pain. Charles had created a world of order to manage the chaos inside him. Everything controlled. Everything safe. Everything cold. Emma stepped forward and placed a bright marigold on the table beside Daniel. "They say marigolds can chase away sadness," she whispered. No one responded. No one had to. The color alone felt like rebellion. In a place built on silence and wealth, Emma's flowers had no place. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why they were needed. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Emma could feel the looks each time she stepped through the grand entryway. Quick glances exchanged between the housekeeper and the butler, the tight smiles from a private nurse, the subtle scoffs from the sharply dressed therapist who always seemed too busy to make eye contact. They didn't say it out loud, not at first. But their silence was loud enough. One afternoon, as Emma arranged a bouquet of soft yellow tulips in Daniel's sunroom, the therapist lingered at the door. His arms were crossed, expression unreadable. "You really believe flowers do something?" he asked, more condescending than curious. Emma didn't look up. She gently placed a tulip by Daniel's hand and smiled softly. "I believe some things don't need belief to work," she replied. He chuckled dryly, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. Behind closed doors, the staff spoke freely. "She's not qualified," the nurse had said. "Charles must be desperate." The housekeeper had nodded. "A florist playing doctor? It's irresponsible." To them, Emma was foolish. A romantic. A woman clinging to petals and fairy tales. But Emma never defended herself. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there for the boy who hadn't spoken in a year, but who now, quietly, began reaching for flowers before she even handed them over. That was enough. Emma knew that healing didn't always come with credentials. Sometimes, it came in the form of patience. Of presence. Of believing, when no one else would. And so, while the world around her doubted, she returned each week with blooms in her arms. and faith in her heart that something was blooming inside Daniel too. Emma never arrived empty-handed. Each visit, she brought a new bouquet, never too grand, never too perfect. Just enough to carry a feeling. Sunflowers on Tuesday, bold and bright like a promise. Lavender on Friday, soft and steady like a lullaby. Wild daisies, sprigs of rosemary, delicate baby's breath. Every stem chosen not for how it looked, but for what it might say. Daniel never spoke. He never smiled. But something in his stillness had changed. He watched her now. Not always directly, not for long, but when she laid the flowers in front of him, his fingers would move, just slightly. He'd trace the edge of a petal, gently pinch the stem. And always when she stood to leave, he would tuck one small piece, a petal, a leaf, a tiny blossom, into his palm and hold it close, like it meant something only he understood. Emma never asked what it meant. She didn't need to. It was a language too quiet for words, but loud in its own way. She spoke to him through flowers. Told him stories of fields that never gave up blooming. Of seasons that always returned. Of roots that held on, even when the wind was cruel. And though Daniel never said a word, Emma could feel it. He was listening. With every flower, a wall was coming down. With every petal, something inside him stirred. Others still doubted her. Still rolled their eyes at the florist and her fairy tales. But Daniel held onto those petals like lifelines. And Emma knew in that small sacred way that only a grieving mother could know. Something was beginning to grow. Charles stood by the doorway, arms folded across his chest, watching Emma as she gently placed a bouquet of soft blue cornflowers beside Daniel. The boy, as always, remained silent, but his fingers moved, tracing the petals like they held some secret only he could hear. It had been weeks since Emma began her visits, and though Charles had allowed it, a quiet storm had been brewing within him. He wasn't a man of sentiment. He believed in logic, science, results. Not in flowers and whispers. Finally he spoke, his voice low but firm. "What exactly are you doing, Ms. Emma? This isn't some child's game." Emma didn't flinch. She finished adjusting the ribbon around the stems and turned toward him, calm and steady. "I'm not playing," she said simply. Charles raised an eyebrow. "He's not getting better." Emma tilted her head. "Isn't he?" She glanced toward Daniel, who was now holding a single cornflower in his hand, his thumb gently brushing its edge. Charles followed her gaze, but said nothing. Emma stepped closer, voice soft but sure. "Sometimes, Mr. Whitman, healing doesn't look like progress charts or checklists. Sometimes it's just a boy holding a flower a little longer than he did last time." He exhaled sharply, frustrated. "And you think that means something?" Emma smiled, not smugly, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had known great loss. Sometimes flowers know how to say the things we're too afraid to. Charles didn't respond. But that night, when he walked past Daniel's room, he noticed a neat row of petals lined up on the windowsill. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe silence wasn't the absence of feeling, but the beginning of something deeper. The article appeared on a Thursday morning, bold headline, grainy photo, and enough speculation to set tongues wagging across Savannah's upper circles. From bankruptcy to billionaire's doorstep, the curious case of Emma Calloway. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into judgment. A local reporter had dug into Emma's past, unearthing painful details she had never tried to hide, but never expected to see twisted into scandal. After the death of her daughter, Emma had fallen into debt, lost her home, and struggled for years to rebuild her life. The article painted it as a calculated rise, suggesting that her visits to the Whitman estate were less about flowers and more about fortune. The insinuation was cruel, and it spread fast. Staff at the mansion began to talk more openly now, not behind closed doors. The nurse kept her distance. The therapist didn't bother hiding his smirks. Even the housekeeper, once polite, grew curt. But it was Charles's reaction that cut deepest. He summoned Emma that evening, the article clutched in his hand. His eyes, once tired but warm, were sharp now, guarded. "Is this why you came?" he asked, voice low and cold. Was all of this just a way out of poverty? Emma didn't defend herself. She stood quietly, her hands at her sides, her heart breaking, not from shame, but from the sting of being misunderstood. "I came for the boy," she said softly. "Not the man." But Charles had already looked away. And just like that, the door that had slowly opened between them slammed shut. Not with anger, but with doubt. And Emma, holding back tears, walked away from the one place her flowers had finally begun to bloom. The study was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the polished floor as the evening sun dipped behind the river. Charles stood by the window, the article still crumpled in his hand, his jaw tight with a bitterness he hadn't felt in years. He didn't want to believe it, not after everything he'd seen. Not after the way Daniel had begun to respond, to reach for the flowers, to wait at the window on the morning she came. But the words in the article echoed louder than reason. Words like manipulation, calculated, gold digger. They clawed at the doubt he never knew was there. When Emma entered quietly, bouquet in hand as always, he didn't let her speak. No more. His voice was sharp, final. Emma froze in the doorway. "Charles. Don't." He turned to face her, eyes filled with something far deeper than anger. "I trusted you with my son. I let you into my home. I never asked to be." "But you stayed," he snapped, cutting her off. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You played the part. The quiet florist with a tragic past." Emma's lips parted, but no words came. Charles took a step closer, his voice now trembling. "You think I don't see it? You used him to get to me. To get out of whatever whole life left you in." Emma looked down, the bouquet still trembling in her hands. "I would never use a child," she whispered. But Charles had already turned away. "Please leave. And don't come back." The door closed behind her with the softest click. And for the first time in weeks, the mansion returned to its old self. Orderly. Silent. Cold. But this time, even Daniel didn't reach for the window. Emma didn't argue. She didn't plead, didn't try to explain herself further. There was no grand farewell, no final speech. Only a quiet nod and a heaviness in her steps as she turned away from the place where she had dared to hope again. That night, as the moon cast a silver glow over the riverbank, Emma returned one last time, not through the front door, but by way of the garden gate. The staff had already retired. The house stood still, cloaked in shadows and silence. She walked softly through the yard, past the trimmed hedges and marble fountains, until she reached the sunroom window where Daniel once sat, day after day, with a flower in his hand and stillness in his soul. Emma placed a small bundle on the windowsill, sunflowers, once vibrant, now dried and delicate. Their petals curled inward like whispered prayers. With them, she left a small card, handwritten in the same calm script Charles had once seen on her notes to Daniel. "Even when the light turns away, the sunflower still faces the sun." She didn't ring the bell. She didn't wait to be seen. She simply turned and walked back into the night, the hem of her coat brushing against the grass, her hands empty but her heart still full. She hadn't come to be accepted. She hadn't stayed to be understood. She had come for the boy. And in some small way, she hoped the flowers had said what she no longer could. Behind the glass, Daniel sat in the shadows, eyes wide open. And though he didn't move, one small hand pressed quietly against the windowpane, as if trying to hold on to the warmth that had just walked away. It was late in the evening when Charles found himself alone in the parlor, the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. The house, once again, had fallen into its usual quiet, but it no longer felt like peace. It felt like absence. He stared at the untouched bouquet still resting on the sunroom table, Emma's final gift. The dried sunflowers, brittle and golden, stood like sentinels in a place that had forgotten how to feel. A soft knock broke the silence. It was Gerald, the Whitman family's head butler, loyal for over 30 years, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Tonight, however, his brow was furrowed, and something restless moved behind his eyes. "Sir," he began carefully, "there's something I think you should know about the article." Charles didn't look up. "I've read it." "Yes," Gerald said gently, "but I've also looked into the man who wrote it." That caught Charles's attention. Gerald stepped forward, lowering his voice. "He's connected to your cousin, Elliot. The one who challenged the trust last year." Charles's expression hardened. "He's trying again." "I believe so. Sir, I think the article was planted to discredit you. Or her. Maybe both." Charles leaned back stunned, not by the manipulation, but by his own willingness to believe it. He had doubted Emma. He had cast her out without listening, without asking. And now, all that remained was a withered bouquet and the sound of his son retreating further into silence. Gerald hesitated, then added, "Whatever she was doing, sir, I saw Daniel change. We all did." Charles looked down at the sunflowers, his throat tightening. Maybe the truth had always been simple, and he'd let fear drown it out. The door to Daniel's room creaked open slowly, as if the house itself hesitated to disturb the boy's quiet world. Charles stepped inside, expecting stillness, emptiness, perhaps. But what he found made him stop in his tracks. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a night light. But the walls, once bare and pale, were no longer blank. They were alive. Carefully pinned in rows along the corkboard above Daniel's desk were dried flower petals: lavender, sunflower, daisy, peony. Each one pressed with delicate precision, as though it had been chosen with care, preserved with love. Under each bloom, written in Daniel's small, uneven handwriting, was a name: hope, peace, bravery. Words Emma had whispered to him. Messages she had wrapped in petals. And then Charles saw it. In the center of the wall was a single sheet of paper. A crude drawing, childish and shaky, but unmistakably powerful. A little stick figure holding a bouquet, facing a much larger figure with tears falling from its eyes. Above it, in Daniel's handwriting, were 4 words. "She speaks for me." Charles felt the breath catch in his chest. It wasn't just therapy. It wasn't just flowers. Daniel had been speaking this whole time, just not in the language anyone had bothered to hear. And the woman Charles had sent away without a second thought. She had heard him from the very beginning. His knees nearly buckled as he sank into the chair by the bed, the weight of regret pressing hard against his ribs. He had been so busy searching for results. He had missed the miracle growing quietly on his son's wall. Charles sat in the corner of Daniel's room, his hands trembling, eyes fixed on the wall that had become a silent diary, each petal a word, each pressed flower a sentence his son had been trying to say. All this time, he had waited for Daniel to speak. For a sound. A syllable. Anything that resembled language. He had flown in doctors, poured money into treatments, begged science for answers. But he had never once stopped to ask if maybe, just maybe, his son had already been speaking in a different way. And now, the truth stood in front of him, gentle and undeniable. The lavender meant peace. The sunflower meant hope. The blue cornflower meant longing. And the note, those 4 words, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "She speaks for me." It broke something inside him. Charles pressed his hands to his face, but the tears came anyway, hot, unstoppable, years in the making. Not just for his son, but for himself. For every missed moment. Every assumption. Every time he chose logic over love, structure over softness. He had been deaf to the quiet language of healing. And Emma, she had heard it from the very start. His son had spoken. Not with sound, but with petals. With presence. With faith. and it had taken losing her to finally understand what he had. Charles looked back at the wall through tear-blurred vision, his heart cracking open in a way it hadn't since his wife died. Daniel hadn't been silent. He'd just been waiting for someone willing to listen without needing words. And now, Charles was ready to hear everything. The bell above the door gave its usual soft chime as Emma looked up from the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. The shop had been quiet that morning, filled only with the gentle hum of music and the scent of fresh lavender. When she saw who stood in the doorway, her breath caught. Charles Whitman. He looked older than before. Not in body, but in spirit. As if the weight he'd carried had finally cracked through his polished surface. His eyes searched the room, then found hers. And for a long moment, neither of them said a word. In his hands, he held a bouquet. Lavender. The very first flower she had given Daniel. The one she had chosen for calm, for trust, for quiet beginnings. He stepped forward, his shoes soft against the worn wooden floor, and placed the bouquet gently on the counter between them. Emma didn't reach for it. She only looked at him, waiting. Charles's voice, when it came, was low and broken, not the voice of a billionaire or a father in command. Just a man, humbled. "Thank you," he whispered, "for speaking for my son, when I didn't know how." His eyes welled, but he didn't look away. "And now, I'd like to speak for myself." A pause. Then softer, barely audible. "I'm sorry." Emma's eyes shimmered, but she said nothing. Because in that moment, the lavender said enough. It spoke of healing. Of forgiveness. Of a beginning that neither of them had expected. And for the first time, they stood not as strangers from separate worlds, but as two people who had both lost something. And somehow, through flowers, had found a way back to hope. The gates of the Whitman estate slowly opened, just as they had weeks before, but this time, Emma wasn't just a guest. She was coming home. As the car pulled into the circular drive, the house seemed different. Still grand, still quiet, but softer somehow, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for her return. A few staff members peered discreetly from behind curtains, unsure of what to expect. But before Emma could even step fully onto the path, the front door swung open. And Daniel was there. No nurse. No prompting. Just a little boy with wide eyes and shaking hands, standing alone on the stone steps. He didn't hesitate. He ran, feet pounding across marble and gravel, arms outstretched like wings. Emma barely had time to set down her bag before he threw himself into her, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist and burying his face against her coat. Emma froze, overcome, one hand gently finding the back of his head. And then, a whisper. So faint, so delicate, it might have been the wind. But she heard it. Flower. A single word. Spoken by a child who hadn't uttered a sound in over a year. Emma closed her eyes, the moment pressing against her like the first light of dawn. She didn't cry, not yet. She only held him tighter, rocking gently as if she were cradling the whole world in her arms. Behind them, Charles stood in the doorway, hand to his mouth, unable to move. And in that quiet moment, no doctors, no grand gestures, no scripts. Just one word, from one child, to one woman. A word that meant everything. A word that healed. Not every story ends with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes, the most powerful endings are quiet, like a whisper carried on the wind, or a flower blooming where no one thought it could. Emma never sought recognition, never asked for thanks. What she offered was not a cure, not a miracle, just presence. Just gentleness. Just the willingness to listen in a way the world had forgotten. Charles learned, in time, that not all communication needs to come through words. Some of the truest things a heart can say are said without sound, through a touch, a look, a single bloom placed in silence. He had spent years building walls around his pain, mistaking silence for emptiness. But now, because of a florist with a quiet voice and a steady hand, he understood. Daniel had spoken all along. through petals pressed between pages, through drawings made in crayon and care, through the act of holding on when everything else had fallen away. And Emma had heard him, not because she was trained to, but because she knew the language of grief, the language of love. There are feelings too deep for vocabulary, moments too sacred for speech. But a heart that listens, truly listens, can hear everything. In a world that often moves too fast, demands too much, and values noise over meaning, sometimes all we really need is someone willing to sit beside us, with nothing but quiet understanding and the courage to stay. Because in the end, love doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it simply places a flower in your hand and waits patiently for you to feel it bloom. Some emotions don't need words, only a heart tender enough to hear them. If this story touched your heart, leave a like to help us spread a little more kindness. And if you love healing, heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. See you next time.